Old woman saved 4 orphaned puppies. Years later, you won't believe how they returned the favor. Maggie Hartley had never been one for early mornings, not since her husband Carl passed away 5 springs ago. The mountain cabin they'd built together in Pinterest, with its creaky wooden floorboards and kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon, had grown quiet, too quiet. She had long since stopped setting alarms. Now she awoke only when the sunlight breached the checkered curtains and warmed the folds of the quilt pulled up beneath her chin. That particular morning, the sun rose with a stubborn gentleness. Bluebirds flitted just outside the window as if trying to coax her from bed. She groaned lightly, stiff from sleep, but eventually swung her legs over the edge, her feet finding the familiar rug beside the bed. There was comfort in the routine, the kettle boiling, the chair creaking under her weight, and the chipped mug filled with black tea resting between her palms. She watched the mist curl over the pine trees, their outlines faint like distant memories. She had just settled into her favorite armchair, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, when the knock came, a light tapping, unsure and respectful. Curious, Maggie rose and shuffled across the floor in her slippers, creaking boards betraying her every step. She opened the door to find a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark green uniform standing there, a look of nervous hope on his face. Zach Carter. She recognized him instantly, despite the scruffy beard and the lines that hadn't been there when he was 10 years old and reciting multiplication tables in her third-grade class. "Miss Hartley," he said, then chuckled awkwardly. "I mean, Maggie, sorry, it's hard to shake the habit." "It's all right," she smiled warmly. "I've been called worse. What brings you up the mountain, Zach? Don't tell me you got lost looking for a way back to fractions." That earned a sheepish grin. "Not quite. Well, I have a favor to ask." He gestured behind him, and only then did Maggie see the open truck and the box in its bed. From within came a soft chorus of whimpers and high-pitched barks. Zach led her to the truck. Inside the box were 4 small, golden fur balls, each trembling slightly, eyes wide and uncertain. "Someone left them at the trailhead off Pine Creek," he said, voice tight. "No note, no food, just dumped them. I checked with every shelter from here to Millbury. They're all full. I thought maybe you might be willing to take them, just for a little while." Maggie's heart clenched. 4 golden retriever puppies, their fur matted, their eyes glassy with confusion, but still glowing with the stubborn light of life. She hadn't held something so alive, so utterly dependent, in years. "Just until we find homes for them," Zach added quickly, sensing her hesitation. "You don't have to say yes. I just didn't know who else to ask." She stared into the box, and one of the puppies, bold despite his size, stood on shaky legs and placed a paw on the edge, tilting his head at her. She swore in that instant that he saw her in a way few people had in years. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "All right," she said softly, "but only for a while." Zach exhaled like a man unburdened. "You won't regret it. I'll help with food and anything else you need." They brought the puppies inside. Naming them came naturally. The bold one with the darker coat became Rusty. The smallest, with ears far too large for her head, was Daisy. The one who kept chasing his tail until he fell over was Max. And the one who nestled into the crook of Maggie's elbow and refused to budge, Luna. That first day was chaos. Puppies scampered through the kitchen, knocked over a potted plant, and christened her living room rug in 4 separate puddles. Maggie, who had lived by the clock and structure for decades, found herself improvising with towels, cleaning spray, and laughter. By sundown, her muscles ached, her hands were scratched, and her heart felt unexpectedly full. That night, she fell asleep on the couch, Daisy curled by her feet, Rusty on her chest, Max and Luna squished together in the blanket she had laid out on the floor. The fire crackled quietly, casting long shadows, and for the first time in a long time, Maggie didn't mind the silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was warm, breathing. Days turned to weeks, and Maggie found herself falling into a new rhythm. Morning walks with the pups along the foggy trails, where they would tumble over pine cones and dart after birds they could never catch. Feeding time became a circus of eager paws and wagging tails, and every evening they would huddle together by the fireplace, 4 small bodies pressed against hers. She spoke to them about Carl, about her garden, about how she once dreamed of going to Paris but never quite made it. They listened with the devotion only dogs could offer. The change in her was subtle at first. She started humming again while cooking. She planted flowers along the porch, even though the frost might get them. She reread books she'd forgotten she loved. The loneliness, once a heavy shawl draped across her shoulders, began to unravel. People in town noticed. At the grocery store, she laughed when Clara the cashier teased her about being a new mother again. On at the diner, she brought photos of the pups, and folks crowded around like proud aunties and uncles. Zach came by weekly, always with supplies and always with a hopeful question. Think they're ready for adoption yet? But every time Maggie shook her head, not just yet, they need a little more time. One crisp afternoon, while Luna dozed on her lap and the others played tug-of-war with a worn-out slipper, Zach broached the topic again. This time, Maggie didn't hesitate. She looked him straight in the eye, her voice calm but firm. They've already found their forever home. Zach blinked, his mouth opening as if to argue, but then he saw the way Luna nuzzled into Maggie's sweater. He smiled instead. I figured. Winter crept in slowly, blanketing Pine Arrest with soft snow and painting the world in shades of gray. Maggie didn't mind. Her home was alive with energy, barking, thudding paws, laughter she never thought she'd find again. Each pup developed their own personality. Max was the mischief maker, always testing limits. Daisy remained dainty and thoughtful, often watching the world from the windowsill. Rusty was loyal and brave, following Maggie everywhere like a shadow. And Luna was something else entirely. She stayed close, always watching Maggie with eyes full of ancient understanding. But even in this newfound joy, something unspoken lingered in the background. As December neared, the wind howled stronger, the nights grew longer, and Maggie, ever practical, tested the emergency alert system she'd installed last year after a neighbor's fall. Just in case, she told herself. But there was no sense of doom, only a readiness. She was not the fragile woman who once drifted through days waiting for them to end. She had purpose again, love again, and she had 4 reasons to greet each morning with a smile. They had come into her life needing saving, but it was she who had been rescued, and neither she nor the dogs knew it yet. But their loyalty, their fierce, boundless love, was about to be tested in a way none of them could have imagined. The cabin that once echoed only with silence now pulsed with life. But not all footsteps that approached her door would be kind. And somewhere in the valley beyond the snow-covered ridges, 2 men were heading up the road to Pinterest. But Maggie Hartley was no longer alone. Not anymore. The first true snowfall came on December 20th. It wasn't one of those delicate drizzles of white, the kind that melted by midday. No, this storm arrived with authority, rolling in from the north like a slow-moving wall, swallowing up the sun and turning the sky to pewter. Maggie Hartley stood at her kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug of cinnamon tea, watching the flakes tumble from the sky like bits of paper torn from heaven. Inside the cabin, the fire was already roaring, its golden glow casting flickering shadows across the stone hearth. Max and Daisy were playing a quiet game of tug-of-war with one of Carl's old wool socks, while Rusty patrolled the perimeter of the living room like a soldier on duty. Luna, as always, lay at Maggie's feet, her head resting gently on the top of Maggie's slipper. Outside, the wind howled, a low moan that curled around the corners of the house and tapped against the windows like ghostly fingers. The weather report had warned of a whiteout, urging residents to hunker down and stay indoors. Zach had called earlier in the morning to check on her, his voice tight with concern. Maggie, if it gets too bad, don't hesitate to call me. I mean it. These storms can turn nasty quick. She'd smiled, reassured by his worry. I'll be just fine, Zach. Got enough firewood to last me a month and more food than I know what to do with. Besides, I'm not alone anymore. That last part, she realized as she said it, was the first time in years she'd spoken those words aloud. Not alone. The phrase wrapped around her heart like a blanket. By late afternoon, the snow was coming down in thick sheets, obscuring the tree line beyond her front yard. The world had gone white and still, blanketed in silence. The Hanks, after an enthusiastic romp in the snow earlier, had retreated inside and now lays near the fire, twitching in their sleep. Maggie took the opportunity to settle in with a book, the pages rustling gently as she read, one hand absently scratching behind Luna's ears. She didn't notice the flicker of movement outside at first. It came as a barely perceptible shift, a dark silhouette crossing through the white. At first, she thought it might be a deer, Or maybe even one of the neighborhood kids foolish enough to wander this high up the mountain in a storm. But when the shape grew clearer, two shapes actually, her stomach tightened. Two men, walking shoulder to shoulder. No coats of bright color, no gear for hiking or snowshoeing. Just dark parkas, boots caked with snow, and a certain slowness in their step that suggested they weren't here by accident. Maggie set the book down gently, not out of panic, but with a growing sense of unease. She stood and moved to the window, peeking through the corner of the curtain. The men stopped just beyond the porch, pretending to study the power lines overhead, but neither of them carried tools. No utility truck, no identification. Just matching expressions too slick for strangers and too confident for visitors. She felt Luna stir at her feet. Then Rusty, on the far side of the room, stood up abruptly, his tail stiff, his ears pointed. A moment later, Max and Daisy followed suit, their bodies suddenly tense. Maggie's heart beat faster as she reached for the emergency alert pendant hanging around her neck. She didn't press it yet, but her fingers closed tightly around it. Then came the knock. Not a neighborly tap. It was loud, measured, as if someone were staking claim. Maggie took a deep breath and stepped to the door, keeping the chain lock in place as she opened it a crack. The man in front had a square jaw and two white teeth, his eyes crinkling as he smiled like a salesman who didn't believe in his own pitch. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, voice syrupy. "We're from Pine Ridge Utilities. There's been a downed line up the trail and we just need to check your meters. Make sure everything's secure before it gets worse." Maggie didn't budge. "You didn't call ahead." "It's an emergency dispatch," he replied smoothly. "No time to call, just a quick check, then we'll be on our way." Behind him, the second man shifted slightly, his eyes scanning the cabin's front porch, the roof line, the windows. He didn't smile. Maggie's grip tightened on the pendant. "I'm not letting anyone in, not without ID." Her voice was steady, firmer than she expected. The man's smile faltered. "Come on, ma'am. We don't want you sitting in the dark if this storm gets worse. Just open the door so we can—" "No." Her voice cracked through the air like the snap of a branch. "I've already called the sheriff." That was a lie. She hadn't pressed the pendant, not yet. But something in her tone made the man pause. His smile evaporated. He exchanged a glance with his partner. "You sure about that?" the second man asked, voice lower, harder. And that's when Maggie saw it. The flicker of frustration, the faint twitch in his jaw that gave it all away. They weren't utility workers. They weren't lost. They were predators, and they had chosen the wrong cabin. Before she could shut the door, the first man shoved hard, snapping the chain and throwing the door wide. Maggie stumbled backward, hitting the floor with a gasp. The room erupted into chaos. Max was the first to move, lunging toward the man with a ferocity that shook the walls. His teeth sank into the intruder's leg and the man screamed, staggering backward into the open doorway. Daisy barked sharply, then leapt onto a chair, knocking it over in front of the hallway, blocking the second man's path deeper into the house. Rusty charged like a flash of gold, growling and snapping, his voice deeper and more terrifying than Maggie had ever heard. The second man swore loudly, raising a hand to defend himself as Rusty launched at his thigh. And through it all, Luna remained at Maggie's side, her body curled protectively around her, her teeth bared, but her gaze never leaving Maggie's face, waiting for the signal to act. Maggie, heart pounding, finally pressed the emergency pendant. A soft beep sounded, followed by a woman's voice through the speaker on the wall. "Miss Hartley, is everything all right?" Maggie shouted back. "Break in. 2 men. Send help now." The men tried to retreat, but the dogs wouldn't let them. Max dragged his attacker back toward the door, refusing to release his grip. Daisy darted around their legs, nipping and barking, confusing them with her speed. Rusty drove the second man into a corner, his growls shaking the window panes. The intruders were used to fear, used to dominance, but they hadn't counted on a 78-year-old woman with 4 protectors who loved her more fiercely than anything else in the world. The shrill sound of sirens broke through the storm, distant but growing. The men panicked. One shoved Max away and bolted through the open door, limping, bleeding. The second kicked at Rusty and fled after him, disappearing into the swirling snow. Maggie sat frozen on the floor, tears streaking her cheeks, her breath coming in shaky gasps. But she wasn't broken. Not this time. She looked at Luna, who had licked her hand and then stood watch again, and whispered, "Good girl." And when Sheriff Mike Jennings arrived minutes later, gun drawn and eyes wide, he found Maggie surrounded by 4 golden retrievers, each standing guard. She met his gaze and said, "They saved my life, Mike. Every single one of them." And in that moment, as Zach arrived behind him and knelt beside Rusty, his eyes full of awe, Maggie knew whatever loneliness she had once felt had been replaced by something stronger, something unbreakable. The snow continued to fall, but inside the fire still burned, and so did her spirit. The chapter had turned, and she was not alone. Not anymore. The morning after the storm, the cabin sat blanketed in a hush that only fresh snow could create, a perfect white stillness that stretched in every direction. The forest surrounding Pinterest was buried under soft drifts, the trees sagging under the weight of nature's silence. It was the kind of morning Maggie Hartley used to cherish with her husband, sitting side by the fire, coffee in hand, watching the world pause. But today was different. Today the air buzzed with something far louder than the storm: news, awe, disbelief. The sheriff's cruiser had barely made it down the winding road to her cabin the night before. But by the time the intruders had fled into the darkness and Maggie was safe, a ripple had already begun to spread across the quiet town like cracks in ice. It didn't take long for it to become a wave. Maggie had woken at dawn, still wearing the same thick cardigan from the night before, wrapped in a throw blanket on the couch, the fire long since faded to embers. Rusty had laid across her feet all night like a sentry, his ears twitching at every creak of the house. Daisy was curled up on the armrest like a cat, tail draped over Maggie's shoulder. Luna, as always, had slept at her side, one paw resting across her lap, rising and falling in rhythm with Maggie's breath. Max, the ever-vigilant, had kept post at the front door, refusing to rest even after Zach and Sheriff Jennings assured them the danger had passed. Maggie stirred slowly, blinking up at the frosted windows, and for a moment she wondered if it had all been a dream. But then she shifted her foot and Rusty lifted his head instantly, tail wagging slightly, and she felt the warm heaviness of Luna still pressed against her side. No, it had been real, and they had protected her, not because they were trained to, but because they had chosen to, because they loved her. The knock at the door came just as the kettle began to whistle, and this time Maggie didn't flinch. Max didn't growl. Instead, he padded to the door and sat, tail wagging cautiously. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from the chaos of the night before. She opened the door to find Zach standing there, bundled in a thick jacket, holding 2 steaming coffee cups and a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Behind him was a woman with a camera and a notepad, trying her best not to slip on the icy path. "Morning, Maggie," Zach said, sheepish. "Brought coffee and, well, I hope you don't mind. Word got out about what happened. This is Helen from the Pine Gazette. She asked real nice, and I figured." Maggie blinked at them, then stepped aside. "Come in before you both freeze to death." Zach offered her their coffee, and Helen followed with wide eyes, scanning the modest living room and the 4 dogs now rising to stretch and assess the visitors. "So these are the heroes," she whispered, scribbling something before she'd even sat down. It didn't take long for the questions to start. Helen, it turned out, had been in the business for nearly 20 years, but said she'd never covered a story like this before. 4 golden retrievers defend retired schoolteacher from home invasion, she murmured, reading her own headline aloud. "It practically writes itself." Maggie chuckled softly, cradling the cup of coffee in both hands, the warmth sinking into her bones. "I didn't raise them to be heroes," she said. "I was just supposed to be a temporary stop on their way to somewhere else." Helen looked up, eyes soft. "But they stayed." Maggie nodded, and thank God they did. The conversation drifted between questions and stories, how Maggie had named them, how each had carved a space in her home and heart, how Zach had dropped them off with a promise it would only be for a few days. When Helen asked what had happened during the break-in, Maggie's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. She told the story simply, letting the facts speak for themselves. How Max had bitten the man's leg, how Daisy had blocked the hallway, how Rusty had charged her with a growl that sounded like thunder, how Luna had never left her side, guarding her like a knight. Helen scribbled furiously, pausing only to wipe her eyes at one point. You know, she said finally, there are stories that make you cry because they're sad. And then there are stories that make you cry because they remind you of what's still good in the world. By the time Helen left, she had taken more photos than she could count. Maggie surrounded by the days, the broken door frame still half covered in snow, the emergency alert pendant resting on the mantel. Zach lingered behind, his coffee long since gone cold, watching Maggie with a mixture of admiration and something else. You know, he said softly, I've always known you were tough. But last night, watching you stare those men down, seeing how those dogs fought for you, I realized you don't just teach people how to read and count. You teach them how to live. Maggie laughed, touched but dismissive. Don't go romanticizing an old woman with a pack of dogs and creaky knees. But Zach didn't laugh. He looked around the room, taking in the paw prints on the floor, the scattered toys, the scratches on the baseboards. You've given them more than shelter. You gave them a home. Maggie turned to the fire, eyes glistening. They did the same for me. By mid-afternoon, the article had gone live on the Gazette's website. Maggie didn't have a computer, but Zach pulled it up on his phone, reading it aloud to her while the dogs listened as if they understood every word. And by evening, her landline, usually silent, was ringing off the hook. Friends she hadn't spoken to in years, parents of former students, strangers who'd read the story and then wanted to donate food, blankets, toys. Even the mayor called, offering thanks and proposing a Paws of Valor ceremony to honor the dogs publicly. Maggie shook her head at that one. They don't need medals, she said, scratching Luna's ears. They've already earned their place right here. That night, after a dinner of leftover stew and a treat for each dog, Maggie sat by the fire once more. The house, though still weather-beaten and small, felt enormous with warmth. As she stared into the dancing flames, she thought of Carl. She imagined him sitting in his favorite chair across from her, shaking his head with a wry smile. You always said no more chaos, he'd say. Now look at you, a pack leader. Maggie smiled softly, then looked around the room at her family. Max was asleep on his back, legs in the air like a lazy deer. Daisy lay curled at the corner, nose tucked beneath her tail. Rusty was stationed at the window, his gaze fixed outward, watching the snow fall. And Luna was where she always was, at Maggie's side. Maggie reached down, brushing her hand along Luna's fur. Thank you, she whispered, for all of it. Outside, the wind began to rise again, shaking the icicles from the eaves. But inside, the only sounds were the steady breathing of 4 sleeping eves and the quiet crackle of a fire. Maggie knew the world would keep turning. Storms would keep coming, and trouble might yet knock on her door again. But she wasn't afraid, because when the snow falls and the world turns cold, it's not the strength of the walls that keep you safe. It's the warmth within them. And Maggie Hartley had enough warmth now to light the whole mountain. The sun rose pale and slow the next morning, a soft golden smear over the white canvas of snow that blanketed Pinterest. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely quiet, as though the trees and rooftops were still catching their breath. Maggie Hartley stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, gazing out at the winter-wrapped forest with a strange fluttering in her chest. Not fear, no. That had come and gone. What she felt now was something closer to wonder. The delicate, unfamiliar tremor of becoming someone important again. Or maybe it wasn't becoming at all. Maybe she'd always been important, and the world had just needed reminding. The story of the break-in of the 4 golden retrievers who defended her like sentinels had spread beyond the Pine Gazette. That morning, Zach had come by, his face flushed with excitement as he told her that Channel 9 News wanted an interview. She had nearly dropped her mug. Oh, I don't think so, she'd said quickly, waving off the idea like a gnat in summer. You'll have to find another old lady with a house full of heroes. But he had smiled that patient, lopsided smile of his, the one that reminded her of the boy who used to stay after class to help her clean chalkboards. You're not just an old lady anymore, Maggie. You're the town's heart. People need a story like yours right now. Still, the idea of lights, cameras, and strangers poking around her little sanctuary unsettled her. She didn't want to be famous. She just wanted to be whole. And for the first time in years, she was. The dogs sensed the shift too. They stayed close to her side, more attentive than usual, as if they knew something was stirring beneath the surface of the ordinary. Max in particular had become more alert, watching the front door with a quiet intensity. Daisy, always the most sensitive, had taken to nudging Maggie's hand at random moments, as if to check that she was still there. Luna remained her anchor, shadowing her from room to room, curling up by her feet as she knit, read, or watched the fire. And Rusty, brave, bold Rusty, now positioned himself like a sentinel by the bay window, ears twitching with every sound from the woods. The phone began ringing again by noon. Local newspapers, a rescue organization from 2 towns over, a woman who wanted to write a children's book about Maggie and her dogs. "They're calling it The Miracle at Pinterest," said Clara from the grocery store, who'd stopped by to deliver a basket of fresh bread and pies. "You're the talk of the whole county, Maggie. You better get used to people stopping by with cameras and casseroles." Maggie chuckled, overwhelmed but oddly touched. "Cameras I can do without," she said, "but casseroles I won't turn down." She wasn't used to being at the center of attention. Her life had been spent behind the scenes, raising children not her own, shaping young minds in quiet classrooms, caring for Carl through his illness with steadfast devotion. She had never needed applause, but something about the outpouring of love from the town, people she hadn't seen in years coming forward to say, "We're so glad you're safe," or "We remember what you did for us." It stirred something deep within her, a feeling she hadn't known she was missing: recognition, belonging. That afternoon, Zach returned with another surprise, a crate of dog toys, treats, and supplies donated by the local pet shop. They insisted, he said, helping her carry the items into the living room, said it was the least they could do. Maggie shook her head in disbelief as Rusty and Max sniffed eagerly at the bounty. "They'll be spoiled rotten," she said, though her voice was warm with gratitude. As Zach crouched to hand a plush squirrel to Daisy, he looked up at her with something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not admiration, not concern, something gentler. "I never told you this," he said softly, "but when I was a kid in your class, I used to be scared of reading out loud. I'd hide behind my book, pretend I had a sore throat. You never called me out. You just told me that bravery doesn't mean being the loudest voice in the room. It means being the one who speaks when it matters most." Maggie blinked, the memory faint but familiar. "Sounds like something I'd say," she replied. "You were always listening, even when I thought you weren't." Zach stood, brushing his hands together. "Well, I never forgot. And last night, watching you face down those men, you showed me what real bravery looks like." Maggie felt her cheeks flush, a mix of pride and disbelief. "You're giving me too much credit. It was the dogs who saved me." "Maybe," Zach said, "but they followed your lead." That evening, as the sky blushed pink and lavender behind the pines, Maggie sat on the porch wrapped in Carl's old flannel coat. The dogs sprawled around her like golden clouds. The town below shimmered with lights flickering on one by one. She sipped hot cider from a thermos and watched a snowplow clear the winding road up to her cabin. For a while, she just sat in silence, listening to the distant call of an owl and the quiet huff of Luna's breath beside her. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She reached into the old biscuit tin on the side table and pulled out a faded letter Carl had written her shortly before his death. She had read it many times, but tonight it felt different, heavier with meaning. "Maggie," it began, "I worry that when I'm gone, you'll forget how much light you bring to people. You've always made things grow, even in places no one else could. I hope wherever life takes you, you remember that you were always someone's home." Maggie's eyes brimmed as she folded the letter back into the tin. She looked down at her feet, where Luna now rested her head on Maggie's slipper. "Looks like I made something grow again, didn't I, girl?" she whispered, and the dog's tail gave a soft thump of agreement. The next few days passed in a blur. Reporters came and went, always gentle, always curious. A local artist dropped off a painting, Maggie standing tall in her doorway, the 4 dogs at her side, the forest stretching wide and protective behind them. Children from the elementary school wrote letters. "You are a real-life superhero," one read. "Thank you for loving the doggies and being brave." Maggie taped that one to the fridge. The sheriff returned with news that the 2 men had been apprehended in the next county over, both bearing wounds that matched a certain dog's bite radius. "They won't be coming back," he assured him, "but if they do, we'll have to get them some helmets first." It was strange how quickly life could shift from quiet to extraordinary. But through it all, Maggie remained grounded, rooted in the same soil that had held her steady through loss and solitude. She still chopped firewood in the mornings, still made stew from scratch, still tucked herself into bed before 9. The only difference was the heartbeat of her home had changed. There were paws padding through the kitchen now, tails thumping against table legs, soft snores filling the air at night. The silence she once dreaded had become a symphony. And so, one morning, as she watched Max chase a snowflake, Daisy roll onto her back in the sunbeam, Rusty trot proudly with the pine cone in his mouth, and Luna sit solemnly by her side, Maggie realized the truth she had long tried not to hope for. She wasn't just passing time anymore. She was living again, fully, fiercely, quietly, but with meaning. And though she had once believed her story had ended with Carl's final breath, she saw now that it had merely turned a page. These dogs weren't just guests, they weren't just companions. They were chapters. And she, Maggie Hartley of the mountain town of Pinterest, was writing again. Not with pen and paper, but with laughter and footsteps and the sound of 4 loyal hearts beating beside her own. The snow melted slowly in Pinterest, as if reluctant to relinquish its quiet hold on the earth. By the time March crept over the ridge, the icicles had shrunk to glistening teeth clinging to roof lines, and the once white forest floor was mottled with patches of brown pine needles and emerging green. Maggie Hartley stood on her porch one morning, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching Max bound after a rabbit he would never catch. Daisy sat beneath the porch swing, chewing delicately on a stick like it was a fine dessert, while Rusty barked at a squirrel who seemed entirely unimpressed by his warnings. Luna, as always, stayed beside Maggie, her eyes sweeping the woods like a sentry on duty. Life had returned to a rhythm, but it wasn't the same as before. Not the slow, lonely days filled with tea and memories and the ache of a house too quiet. This rhythm pulsed with energy, with laughter, with the occasional chaos of muddy paw prints on freshly cleaned floors. Maggie didn't mind. In fact, she cherished it. The notoriety that followed the incident had faded, as all news eventually does. The headlines stopped, the reporters moved on, but what remained was something deeper. People in town stopped Maggie on the street to ask about her golden gang, dropping off bags of treats or handmade bandanas embroidered with the dogs' names. Children who had never met her before would wave from across sidewalks. Even the mayor had shown up with a plaque one chilly Saturday morning that read, "For courage, loyalty, and love, to Maggie and the guardians of Pinterest." Maggie had thanked him, then tucked the plaque in a drawer. She didn't need awards. The reward was right in front of her, fourfold. As spring approached, Zach's visits grew less formal. At first, he still wore his animal control jacket, arriving under the guise of checking on the dogs. But lately, he showed up in jeans and a sweater, carrying things like homemade muffins or a new leash he'd seen and just thought would suit Luna. Maggie teased him about his thin excuses, but she didn't mind. There was comfort in his presence, in the quiet way he brought warmth into her world without asking anything in return. One afternoon in late March, Maggie invited him to stay for dinner. They ate on the porch, watching the dogs wrestle in the yard, their fur lit golden by the dying sun. After they finished eating, Zach leaned back in his chair and looked over at her. "You know," he said slowly, "I think they were meant to find you. All of them." Maggie sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. "Maybe I was meant to find them," she replied. He nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I wasn't sure when to give you this, but I think you'll want to see it." Maggie opened the envelope carefully, her fingers trembling a little. Inside was a letter from the Regional Animal Rescue Board. It was official, stamped, and signed. At the bottom was a single line that made her heart stutter. "The foster designation for Rusty, Luna, Max, and Daisy has been officially removed. They are now considered permanent residents of the Hartley household." Maggie read the line twice, her eyes filling with tears. Not because it changed anything. She'd known from the very first week that she could never let them go. But because now it was real. No more waiting for a call. No more wondering if someone would come claim them. No more pretending it was temporary. This was their home. For good. Forever. She looked up at Zach, her voice catching. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He smiled, soft and staid. "Just doing what you taught me, giving someone a place to belong." That night, as the sky turned a velvet blue and stars began to appear one by one, Maggie sat on the living room floor surrounded by her family. She didn't call them dogs anymore, not in her heart. They were pieces of her, stitched back into a life she hadn't realized had been unraveling. Max rested his head on her lap, eyes half closed. Daisy lay curled against her hip, her breathing soft and even. Rusty sprawled in front of the fire, tail twitching in his dreams. And Luna, dear Luna, sat upright at Maggie's side, still watching. Always watching. Maggie stroked Luna's head gently and closed her eyes. Her body was older now. Her bones ached more. But her spirit, it felt young again. As though the clock had turned back just enough to remind her how it felt to be alive in the truest sense. There had been a time when she thought her story was over, that her purpose had passed along with Carl, leaving only quiet days and a slow march toward an inevitable end. But purpose, she'd learned, wasn't always loud or grand. Sometimes it came in the form of 4 abandoned puppies in a box. Sometimes it had muddy paws and unshakable loyalty. Sometimes it reminded you that love wasn't something reserved for the young. It lived wherever you were willing to open your heart. And Maggie had opened hers, wide enough to let life back in. Months passed, the forest around the cabin bloomed, bees buzzed among the wildflowers Maggie had planted again, daring to believe in beauty. The garden Carl once tended now bore sprouts of color, and the porch was never without a dog or two sprawled lazily in the sun. One morning she awoke to find Luna sitting at the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on something outside. Maggie rose, heart calm, and followed the dog to the window. There, on the trail that led down the mountain, stood a young woman holding the hand of a small boy. They were reading the wooden sign Zach had carved and nailed to the base of the path weeks ago. "Welcome to Hartley Hollow, home of the Golden Guardians," Maggie smiled. The boy pointed toward the cabin, and his mother nodded. They didn't come closer, but the moment lingered like a soft breath of spring air. Later that day, Maggie took the dogs for a walk down that same path. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and the wind whispered through the trees. Max ran ahead, barking at butterflies. Daisy trotted beside her, always polite, always observant. Rusty darted between trees, daring the world to keep up. And Luna, her ever-faithful Luna, never left her side. As they reached the clearing near the trailhead, Maggie paused. The valley stretched wide below, a patchwork of green fields and winding roads. She stood there for a long time, just breathing it all in. Not as a goodbye, but as a promise to keep going. When they returned to the cabin, twilight had begun to settle in, the dogs curled up in their usual spots, exhausted and content. Maggie made herself a cup of tea and took it to the porch, where the sky burned orange behind the trees. She held the mug in both hands, savoring its warmth, and whispered softly into the wind, "Thank you." Whether she was speaking to Carl, to the toss, to the universe itself, she didn't know, and it didn't matter. What mattered was the life she had reclaimed, the joy she had rediscovered, the love she had welcomed home. Inside, the fire crackled. The dogs stirred in their sleep. And Maggie Hartley, once alone on a mountain, now lived in a house overflowing with fur, laughter, purpose, and the kind of peace that only comes when you stop waiting for life to change and start living the change yourself. She had given 4 dogs a home, but they had given her everything. Forever.